So we all have those books that have been on our TBR forever, and that we're just kind of intimidated by enough so that we're willing to keep putting off reading the book. I think everyone has a small list of books like that they just put off reading and put off reading for years and years and years, and it's a slightly different list for everyone, I think. But one book that a lot of people I know, at least, for whom one particular book often tops their list, that book is this little thing that I have just finished yesterday. And, you know, in terms of this idea of an intimidating book, it is ultimately kind of, I feel like, a bit of a silly notion. Yeah, and I think we all sort of on some level probably know that it's kind of silly to be intimidated by a book, because, I have found that the times when I have finally gotten around to reading a book like this one that has intimidated me for a long time and that I've put off for a long time, what you realize very quickly is that they are just books. That is all they are, which may either sound pompous or may sound hopelessly trivial, but they are just books, I will have you all know. So, but anyway, this is a book where it's not only a book that often tops people's list of books that they're intimidated to read, it also often tops the list of books that people aren't really sure whether or not they should read because they're not sure whether or not it's really worth the effort, because it does take a lot of effort, and, it is both difficult in style and it is long. My edition, 783 pages. So, I mean, it's a substantial book, it's not easy, so, should everyone read it? I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end of this video. Anyway, I want to talk about my personal experience reading James Joyce's Ulysses, and if that helps anyone watching this video to decide whether or not it is worth reading for them, then that'll be awesome. If it doesn't, then I guess this will just be sort of a video that hopefully some people will find kind of interesting, where I just talk about what I thought of a book. So anyway, to start with, some basics about Ulysses, in case there are people watching who might not know that much about Ulysses. It was published in 1922. James Joyce had previously published two works of fiction, Dubliners, which is a collection of short stories all about people incidentally living in Dublin, and A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is his slim, heavily autobiographical kind of bildungs roman about a character named Stephen Dedalus, who is sort of an aspiring poet and artist and also a talented musician, which is, as I said, heavily autobiographical, and Stephen Dedalus appears in Ulysses as a character, as a major character. Ulysses is unlike either of those two other books because of its experimental style. It's just sort of depth of diving into the heads of the characters it portrays. So what Ulysses is about, obviously the title would suggest that it is based in part on Homer's Odyssey, and it is, but what it's about is it tells the events of a single day in Dublin, June 16th, 1904, which is actually a day on which a lot of sort of festivals take place, called Bloom's Day, after the person who you could say is sort of the stand-in for Odysseus himself, Leopold Bloom. Leopold Bloom, there are three major characters: Leopold Bloom, Stephen Dedalus, as I said, and Molly Bloom, who is Leopold's wife. And this book just tells the events of this one day. It mostly, for the most of the book, follows Leopold, but it also follows Stephen Dedalus for a good chunk. And the final 60 to 70 pages are the interior monologue of Molly Bloom. So that last chapter that is just her thoughts is often referred to as Molly's soliloquy, because it's just all her thoughts. And even though she only gets that one chapter from her perspective, she really, by the end of it, is a fully realized character, despite the fact that, she doesn't appear as a character in any of the other chapters, and we don't really see her do anything throughout the whole book. The events that are reported are all pretty mundane. Nothing intense happens. Leopold goes to a funeral, and then he goes to a newspaper office to ask for an advertisement to be put in the newspaper. Then he goes to a bar and listens to Simon Dedalus, who is Stephen Dedalus' father, sing an aria from an opera. And then he goes to meet with a business partner, and then he happens across Stephen Dedalus at a maternity hospital, and then he follows Stephen Dedalus to the red light district and stops Stephen Dedalus from spending way too much money on a prostitute, and then he takes Stephen Dedalus home with him, and sort of asks him if he would consider sort of letting Leopold Bloom's wife Molly, who is an accomplished concert soprano, teach him how to sing, because Stephen has a lot of musical talent, in exchange for Stephen teaching Molly Italian, and also offers possibly to publish some of Stephen Dedalus's poetry. So it's really just super mundane events being reported. And, you know, when I was talking to people in my family about this book, because I couldn't shut up about this book while I was reading it at home over the holidays, when I was talking to it with them, I would tell them that it reports the events of a single day in Dublin, and they would be like, how on earth is it that long? But I told them that it's because it dives very deeply into the heads of these characters. So I've talked a little bit about the characters, but I want to just go in depth about the three major characters a little bit. So Leopold Bloom is obviously the sort of stand-in for Odysseus. I think that the parallels between this novel and the Odyssey shouldn't be taken too far. They're all pretty loose to start with. So, you know, I think symbol hunting for parallels from the Odyssey to this book are not apt, I suppose. Anyway, Leopold Bloom is sort of the stand-in for Odysseus. He's an advertising agent. He seems kind of impotent, but very sort of kind-hearted and nice and wants to get along with people. He's often ostracized for being Jewish. Obviously, Bloom is not stereotypically Irish name, because Leopold Bloom's father was from Hungary. His original name was actually Virag. That was his last name, and then he changed it to Bloom. I don't know how really you get from Virag to Bloom, but so it happened. And so Leopold Bloom is, he's half Jewish, really, and also his father converted from Judaism to Protestant Christianity, and then Leopold later converted to Catholicism. So he's really not Jewish in the strictest sense, but he is of Jewish descent. He has a daughter, Millie, who is 15 years old, and he also, importantly, did have a son, but his son only lived for 11 days before dying, and that actually is very important to Leopold Bloom's character. We have Stephen Dedalus, who was in medical school in Paris, but was called home very abruptly because his mother was dying. And that is, again, very important to Stephen Dedalus' character. His mother was dying, and he went to her deathbed and sang for her. But, importantly, he would not pray for her. His mother was very pious and always, promoted her son's religious faith. But Stephen Dedalus, lost his faith, and so he just said that he couldn't bring himself to pray for her. And this kind of haunts him throughout Ulysses. And Stephen Dedalus is also an aspiring poet and just writer in general, and is also a talented musician. Finally, we have Molly Bloom, who is Leopold Bloom's wife, who only really gets her own say at the very end of the book for about 60 to 70 pages, but she does get quite a say at that last stage of the book. One thing that is preoccupying Leopold for much of the book is the fact that his wife is about to embark on an extramarital affair. At about 4 p.m. on this particular day, she has sex with her manager. She is a concert soprano, and so this man is her manager, and they're having an affair together. And she, despite only having that 60 to 70 page monologue at the end, or soliloquy it's usually called, she is such a fascinating, complex character, and she absolutely is, like, fully fleshed out in the space of those 60, 70 pages. Anyway, so, and actually, I think that, despite the fact that this novel certainly doesn't pass the Bechdel test, I guess, despite that, it certainly is, in terms of its attitude towards women, it actually is quite progressive, especially when you look at other authors who were writing around the time that James Joyce was writing, like D.H. Lawrence, God help us. So, yeah, I mean, anyway, So those are the three major characters, and then just a little note on the sort of structure of this novel, because it is kind of a big deal. It is divided into 18 episodes. also called chapters, and each of those episodes is very loosely based on an incident from the Odyssey. So there's one episode that's usually referred to as the Circe episode, which makes the episode where Odysseus slept with Circe, and there's a chapter called the Sirens, which is sort of parallels the incident in the Odyssey where Odysseus and his crew encounter the Sirens, and there's etc. So but again, I don't think that should be taken too far, because I just think that symbol hunting is not the greatest way to get yourself excited about a work of literature. So what was my experience reading this book? Well, I will say that it is very true that it is not an easy book. When I started it, I did try to just go in completely blind and just go in without any help and just see what I could make of it, just throw myself in. And there were some people who recommended that as a way to read it, that you could do that. But I personally, I get really frustrated when I'm reading a book and I feel like I don't know what's going on or what characters are referring to and such. And the thing with Ulysses is that if you don't have help while reading it, there are going to be long sections of it where you don't really know what the characters are talking about or what's going on. So I knew that would frustrate me, and so what I started out doing was I went to SparkNotes, and I would read the SparkNotes summary for each episode, both the summary and the analysis, and that worked well enough for the first 3 episodes, which are all, or the first 3 episodes, which are all pretty digestible. The 3rd episode is probably one of the most difficult in the book, but I still managed to make it through on just the SparkNotes summary. But then beyond that, I could tell that I was going to need more help than just SparkNotes, and so what I downloaded, and it was stupid expensive, but it was really worth it in terms of making it through the book. What I downloaded was a book called The New Bloomsday Book by Harry Blamires. So I had it on my Kindle, a Kindle app that is, and what The New Bloomsday Book is it's just about a 200-page book where Harry Blamires just explains what's going on in every scene, and also gives you some sort of idea of thematic resonances and symbolic sort of importance of certain motifs that appear. And it was essential to me. There were definitely points in Ulysses where I would have been lost without the New Bloomsday Book. There were also points where I didn't really need it. There are points in Ulysses that are much more straightforwardly narrated than others. But I would have been, I feel like, lost without it, because, I don't know about everyone else, but I am a reader who gets really frustrated really easily if I feel like I am just not getting what's going on a page-by-page basis. I get so frustrated. So I needed that. So, I don't know. I guess I would say every reader of Ulysses is probably slightly different. So there are probably going to be readers out there who could just jump in and would be fine with sort of not quite knowing what's going on all the time and just get swept up in the language and the sort of weird stream of consciousness style and such. But I'm not one of them. I need to know what's happening. And with the New Bloomsday Book, I will say that reading Ulysses was a significantly easier task. It wasn't drudgery. It wasn't, again, it wasn't this frustrating experience of not knowing what's going on page by page. It was still slow because I was having to stop every few pages to read the summary from the New Bloomsday Book. The way that I used the New Bloomsday Book on a page-by-page basis, basically, was that I would read a few pages in Ulysses, and when it came to a point where I no longer felt like I knew what was going on, then I would read a small section of the New Bloomsday Book. And that would presumably illuminate some of what I had just read. Occasionally, after reading the piece from the New Bloomsday Book, I would go back and reread a small section of what I had just read to just sort of get it a bit better, but not always. Whether or not I went back to reread the small sections had a lot to do with how interesting I found what was going on. So if I wasn't particularly interested in what was going on, then I just sort of took Harry Blameyre's word for it and moved on. But that's sort of how I used it. Occasionally I would read ahead a little bit in the New Bloomsday book. If it were a particularly difficult part of the book, I would read ahead so that I could read along while already sort of knowing what was going on. Yeah, so I didn't have a particularly scientific way of using it, but that was generally what I did. So again, like if you want to read Ulysses, you're just gonna have to figure out whether or not you want a guidebook, whether or not you want to jump in head first without any help, whether or not you want to just go ahead with the Spark Notes or something. I'm sure that there are helpers online. There are also footnotes online. Ulysses is a heavily, referential and allusive book, and I'm sure that like 99% of those allusions and references went right over my head. Occasionally I would see one that I actually recognized, which I was always sort of proud of. He references like Hamlet a lot. He references obviously the Odyssey, and so occasionally I would actually just get the references. He also references the Bible a lot, and I would occasionally get those too. But again, like, I'm sure that there are many that I did not see. And so Ulysses is sort of in need of footnoting, but I ended up not really paying much attention to footnotes in that regard. I tried to just enjoy the story and the style and the characters and the thoughts of the characters and such, and I figure I can wait to delve into those references on a reread, because it is a book that, if you really want to understand, you do kind of need to read it multiple times. Now, something like the New Bloomsday book will help with that issue, because, one of the blurbs for the New Bloomsday book on its Amazon page says that it will give you an understanding of Ulysses that before the New Bloomsday book was published, you wouldn't have been able to have it until you'd read it for a second or maybe even a third time. So, if you read the New Bloomsday book, you will presumably have a deeper understanding than Ulysses than if you necessarily would just go in blind. But anyway, so I'm gonna stop talking about the guide because I have other things I want to talk about. So, a question I'm interested in is, why is Ulysses so hard? Why is it considered one of the most difficult books to read? Usually what people say with regards to why it's difficult is it's because of the stream of consciousness style. The quintessential example of that would be the final chapter, Molly Bloom's soliloquy, which is literally just, kind of scary blocks of prose with no punctuation or anything like that, and no real indication of where one thought ends and one thought begins, or who or what she's necessarily talking about. And that's usually considered the big difficulty in Ulysses. But I will say that in terms of this particular style of stream of consciousness, which is what most of us think of, I think, when we think of stream of consciousness, with these just blocks without any punctuation, that is only the last chapter. Most of the rest of the book is written in pretty conventional sentences. Just as an example, here is a page from earlier in the book, so you can maybe see that there are actual paragraph breaks, and if I were to be able to show you a bit closer, there are also actual sentences and commas there. So, I don't know if I really agree that it's the stream of consciousness style that makes it difficult, aside from Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end. What I think makes it difficult is that James Joyce doesn't really do any foregrounding for you in terms of what the characters are thinking or talking about, or what frames of references they have when they're talking to each other. The sort of analogy that I made when I was thinking about this is that it's almost as though you're just in a cafe or in a bar and you're just overhearing people talking, and obviously you have no context for what's going on in their lives, or what they know that you might not know, or their relationship with the people around them, and so you'll hear the conversation of those people and not really quite be able to get everything, just because you don't have all the context that those people have for the conversation that they're having, right? And Ulysses is written like that. It gives you dialogue, it gives you thoughts of the characters, but it doesn't give you all the context that you would need to get all the nuances of what they're thinking about and why they're thinking about it and the way that they're thinking about it and what they're talking about and why they're talking about it the way that they're talking about it. And there's an added dynamic too. It's a bit more than just if you were to go to a bar or a cafe in the modern day in the place where you live. It's also the fact that it takes place in 1904 in Dublin. I'm obviously an American who has lived primarily in the 21st century. So there are just a lot of historical events, cultural events and such that the characters in Ulysses will know just because, they will know in the way that I know about our current president or about whatever the latest hit single by someone, that's playing on the radio. They will know those things, and I won't. And James Joyce doesn't take any time to bring you up to speed on those frame of references that the characters have that you don't. And so they will just start talking or just start thinking about something without giving you any kind of context for it. And that is what makes it difficult. It's not really the style itself in which it's written. Once you have that foregrounding in what they're thinking about and such, the style is pretty straightforward. And I want to just give you one particular example, and this is a good example because it's actually one of the few passages where you really don't need much context, where it's pretty much just a very poetic meditation on the sort of cycle of death and rebirth, and it's coming from the mind of Leopold Bloom. So this is very characteristic for me of much of the style of the book, and so this is what Leopold Bloom is thinking. His smile faded as he walked, a heavy cloud hiding the sun slowly, shadowing Trinity's surly front. Trams passed one another, ingoing, outgoing, clanging. Useless words, things go on same, day after day. Squads of police marching out, back. Trams in, out. Those two loonies mooching about. Dignam carted off. Mina Purefoy swollen belly on a bed, groaning to have a child tugged out of her. One born every second somewhere, other dying every second. Since I fed the birds 5 minutes. 300 kicked the bucket. Other 300 born, washing the blood off. All are washed in the blood of the lamb, bawling, ah. Cityful passing away, other cityful coming, passing away too, other coming on, passing on. Houses, lines of houses, streets, miles of pavements, piled up bricks, stones, changing hands, the owner, that. Landlord never dies, they say. Other steps into his shoes when he gets his notice to quit. They buy the place up with gold, and still they have all the gold. Swindle in it somewhere. Piled up in cities, worn away age after age, pyramids in sand, built on bread and onions, slaves, Chinese wall, Babylon, big stones left, round towers, rest rubble, sprawling suburbs, jerry-built, Cairwan's mushroom houses, built of breeze, shelter for the night. No one is anything. So yeah, there are references in there that you won't get without having necessarily read the book. So, he talks about Mina Purefoy, and a couple of other people who you won't know about. But the sentences are pretty straightforward. I mean, at least in Leopold Bloom's chapter, they're all pretty short and easy to get. So really, it's getting that foregrounding that's hard. And a book like the New Bloomsday Book will give you that sort of foregrounding, I think. So that sort of brings me to the big question, which is this book worth all of this effort of reading an entire second book to understand it, and reading all the SparkNotes summaries to get it, and, going online to look for footnotes and all this stuff. Is it really worth all that effort? I will say that I'm glad I read it, because there were some moments of real payoff. For example, that passage that I just read for you, I love that passage so much. It is really one of the most beautiful things that I think I've ever read. I have read it, gone back and reread it several times before coming to read it on this video, which is, I think, why my reading was a lot better than it usually is when I read out a passage in a video. But there were moments like that of huge payoff where I was just like, holy crap, the writing there is just spectacular. Or there were moments of real emotional payoff. For example, there's a scene where Stephen Dedalus's mother's ghost visits him in a sort of there's one particular episode that's sort of full of hallucinations and whatnot. It's kind of a zany episode, very reminiscent of Goethe's Faust Part 2. But in this sort of zany episode, Stephen Dedalus is visited by the ghost of his mother, towards whom he feels a lot of guilt because he didn't pray for her. And she visits him in this really powerful scene that's very reminiscent of Hamlet, the ghost of Hamlet visiting, Hamlet Jr., and also very reminiscent of the banquet scene in Don Giovanni, where the statue of the Commendatore comes to life and comes to pass judgment upon Don Giovanni for his murder of the Commendatore. And it's this really powerful scene. And there's this, very soon after that, there's this really powerful scene where Stephen Dedalus is sort of left barely conscious in a fetal position on the ground, singing fragments of the song that he sung to his mother on her deathbed. And Leopold Bloom is sort of looking on at him, and Leopold Bloom thinks that Stephen is singing a song about a girlfriend. And sort of says, oh, well, a girlfriend, a woman in his life, surely that would be the best thing for him. Because he can see that Stephen is sort of struggling as just a person at the moment, He's getting in with prostitutes a lot. He's, I don't know if he's necessarily drinking more than he should be, but he certainly drinks a lot in this book. He just dropped out of medical school. He is homeless at the moment. He doesn't live with his father. So Leopold Bloom just sees Stephen in this state and says, well, yeah, a girlfriend would be the best thing for him. But of course, we, as the reader, know that he is misinterpreting what Stephen is singing. And then right after that, there is this incredibly moving scene where Leopold hallucinates an image of his own son, who, as I said, died after only 11 days after his birth. And he sees a vision of what his son would have been if he had lived. He would have been about 10, 11 years old during the events of Ulysses. And so he sees this 10-year-old boy. Actually, he sees the 10-year-old boy reading what I'm guessing is the Talmud or the Torah, because he's reading from right to left, and he just sees him, and there are just moments like that of real huge payoff, and I think you need all of this. I think you need all of this, the rest of this, to get those moments of payoff for them to be powerful. I think you really need everything that's in this book. So I'm glad I read it, if only for that reason. But also, another thing that I personally really liked about it was that I feel like it's a book that's ultimately about how our everyday experiences are far more important and profound than we tend to think they are. Because this is a retelling of Homer's Odyssey as just a few people bumming around Dublin, right? And so it's all about how those everyday acts of just, again, going to funerals, going to a bar, singing an aria, singing songs, on the fly, and such, are actually as important as the journeys of Odysseus or the struggles of Hamlet. We're just not very good at realizing it because we don't have all these sort of epic kind of surroundings around us. We're just, we're sort of trapped in our mundane everyday existence. And so I came out of this book feeling very elevated, if that's not too pompous to say. I came out with a greater sense of how my everyday existence is important. And I think in that sense it is kind of a religious book, a secularly religious book, if that's not a total contradiction in terms, because I think religion is also about elevating the mundane everyday human acts, and that's also what Ulysses is about. And so I'm really glad I read it just for those two reasons, those moments of huge payoff and just that feeling of sort of elevation. Especially in Molly Bloom's soliloquy, which is just, again, one of especially the end is just one of the most gorgeous things I've ever read. So I'm glad I read it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I think everyone should read it. So I've jotted down a few notes regarding who I think would like this book and sort of qualities of a reader that might like Ulysses. And again, I'm not pretending to be definitive in this. I am an amateur. I am a novice. I have only read the book once. I am not the most well-read person in the world. I'm not a professor or anything. But just based on my experience, these are the people who I think might like Ulysses. If you have an interest in literary modernism, I'm loath to say that it's required reading, but it is, one of the seminal works of modernism. And so if you are interested in Virginia Woolf or T.S. Eliot or others around that time, then Ulysses would certainly be a natural book for you to read next if you've already read some of those other authors. If you are more interested in style and form and sentence making than necessarily a really eventful story, then you will like Ulysses, because again, there are passages like the one that I read that are just gorgeous, and that you should just accept they have no bearing on the story, but that are just gorgeous. And that's not to say that Stephen, Leopold, and Molly aren't all really compelling, interesting characters. But just like, on a superficial level, the plot of this book is not particularly interesting. There's not all that much that happens. It's not a Moby Dick where we're hunting the white whale or something. And so you need to sort of be prepared to be more interested in, again, form and character-driven stories and style than a great plot. And also, I will say, if you can sit through a lot of tedium for the sake of a really huge payoff, then you might like Ulysses. If you've read other books that are like that, where there is a lot of just drudge what feels like literary drudge work for a large payoff, then you might like Ulysses. And I will say that there were lots of points in this book where I was pretty indifferent to what was going on. I was just sort of, reading along with the new Bloomsday book and then reading from Ulysses and just sort of trying to just get what was going on, nodding my head along, and not really feeling like I was getting all that much out of it. There are long sections of Ulysses that are like that, where you kind of where you might have a hard time seeing the point, and I did as well. So I will say that. But if you can stomach that for the sake of large payoff, then you might like it. So, those are my thoughts on Ulysses. I'm not sure how long this video is going to be, but anyway, give me your thoughts. If you've read Ulysses, or you're someone who is struggling with whether or not you want to read Ulysses, or if you have tried to read Ulysses, or if you have read any other Joyce, or any other modernists, I mean, just give me your thoughts. I really would love to talk about this book with as many people as possible, because, even though even though I'm not entirely certain at this point whether it will go down as a huge favorite of mine, I am certainly fascinated by it. So, anyway, thank you all for indulging me today, and I will talk to you all in my next video. Bye, guys.